Nehemiah chapter 13, I'm going to share with you 5 points, and you can write them down, and then maybe some other day we'll fill them in. But I just want to focus on one of those things in light of us right now. There's so many things in the passage, it's there, and I believe in exegetical preaching, just preaching what's next. But there was one point I wanted to really, and I felt impressed tonight to just kind of focus on that. Someone said, in preparation for chapter 13 here, someone said, if Nehemiah's memoirs, remember this is what sometimes this book is called, Nehemiah's memoirs, if Nehemiah's memoirs had been an historical novel instead of an accurate record of events, then bringing down the curtain at the end of chapter 12, or maybe at the end of verse 3 on chapter 13, would have rounded off the story and brought it to a perfect conclusion. Remember last Sunday night, they were having revival and God was blessing. It actually started in chapter 8 or 9, I guess it was, and just having revival. And they were weeping, then they had joy, and then they confessed their sins and worshiped God. And boy, it was a great, great revival that was going on in the book of Nehemiah. Boy, that would have been a good place, if you were writing a novel, that would have been a good place to say the end, because it was on a high note. The author goes on to say, with this kind of ending, we would all have rested easily and felt inwardly glad that in one man's experience at least there had been a happy resolution of all the many conflicts of life. Instead, he says, of this kind of conclusion, there is an appendix. This appendix, referring to chapter 13, proves the wisdom of Thomas Jefferson's now famous observation, eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. And I might add, eternal vigilance is the price of revival. Revival doesn't last. It's always challenged. Now, I'm not talking about revival meetings, although there's nothing wrong with having revival meetings. My pastor used to say, we're not going to have a revival meeting, we're going to have a revival effort. We'll find out after the services are over if we had revival. And I think that was a lot of truth in that. But I'm not talking about revival meetings where you have a guest evangelist come in, he speaks for 5 or 6 nights and so forth. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm all for that. But I'm talking about the kind of revival that really ought to occur Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night as a way of life in a local church. If our only revival is going to be once every year or something like that, we're not going to have much revival. But I believe it should be every time. But it's not something we can just assume. In other words, we can't just assume that everything's going to go well. Boy, 2020 has proven that to be true, has it not? And I was thinking about that. It's been tough. And as I thought about the platform, I was just standing there, sitting there, and I felt impressed to zero in on one thing of the 5 things that I want to share with you. And I want to give them to you just so you will have an accurate end to the book of Nehemiah. Bear in mind now, Nehemiah he came actually, more than 12 years before this, but he came and heard about the terrible situation in Jerusalem, that the walls were battered down and the gates were burned and the streets were filled full of rubble and the people were discouraged, and there were just a handful of people mulling about in Jerusalem and everybody else was in the countryside. And he just began to pray about it, and God began to press him, and Nehemiah, using Nehemiah's words, the good hand of God came upon him and called him and said, no, you go back and you rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Now remember, Zerubbabel and Ezra had already come several years earlier to build the temple. So the temple had been rebuilt. Now, he'll mention the temple tonight in the text, but the temple had been rebuilt, the so-called second temple, and the inglorious temple. You've heard it referred to that sometimes. But Nehemiah came and rebuilt the walls. Now, he was there for 12 years. We see that in the text tonight. He was there for 12 years in his first term. Then after that, he went back to the king, back in Shushan the palace. Now, we don't know how long he was there. Some commentators think he was there for 12 years, another 12 years. I think that's probably a little too long. Some think he was there maybe a year. That's probably not enough time for all of these things to develop that happened in chapter 13 that he had to come back and correct. But probably 6, 7 years he was gone, and then he came back for a second term as the governor of Judah under the king. When he came back that second time, there were a lot of things he had to deal with. Now, what I'm going to do, I was going to give a lot more preaching on this, but I think I'm just going to read some of it to you so you'll know about it. And then I'll focus on one thing, and then we'll go home tonight. There are 5 things that Nehemiah discovered when he came back. Revival, when he left, revival was intense. When he left, boy, they were following the Lord. They were right with, I don't think it was a phony revival. I think it was real thing. But folks, it doesn't matter. You might get right with God and turn around the next week, you could be away from the Lord. It happens that fast. But I want you to notice some things that happened that can happen in your life and my life that will hinder revival. I'm just going to give them to you, maybe a few comments, then I want to focus, as I said, on one. Look in verse 4. We'll begin with that because that's where the revival has begun or has collapsed. And before this, now that's referring probably to before his return for the second term when he discovered all this mess. So during that interlude when he was back with the king and Israel, or Judah, was on its own. And before this, Eliashib, the priest. Now, Eliashib is mentioned 2 or 3 times, and it's always the high priest. So I think this is probably the same person. Having the oversight of the chamber of the house of our God, was allied. The word allied sometimes means married, a marital relationship. Not that he married him, but probably a daughter did. Notice who he was allied with. Tobiah. Tobiah. That was one of 3 guys that had made fun of the Jews, had been an enemy of the Jews, had done everything they could to stop the work being done. And while Nehemiah's with the king, this knothead, that's a theological term for a dummy, this knothead has his daughter, probably this is what it means, marry Tobiah. Now, if that's not bad enough, he prepared, verse 5, he prepared for him a great chamber where aforetime they laid the meat offerings, the frankincense, and the vessels, and the tithes of the corn, the new wine, and the oil, which was commanded to be given to the Levites, and the singers, and the porters, and the offerings of the priests. Here was a room in the temple where these sacred items would be kept, these sacrifices to be used for the Levites and the singers. He emptied out that room. Not only did he get married, have his daughter get married to Tobiah, but he emptied out a room in the temple and moved Tobiah in. I just can't fathom that. Then he says in verse 7, I like this, and I came to Jerusalem. Now, if you're going to see Nehemiah as anything but a weakling, anything but a sissy, listen to how he responds. And I came to Jerusalem, understood of the evil that Eliashib did for Tobiah in preparing him a chamber in the courts of the house of God, and it grieved me. Now, in the New Testament, the Greek word behind the word grieved is the word to pain, to feel pain. In the Old Testament, this is the word that literally means to tremble or to quiver. What does that mean? He was so angry, he began to shake. Now, I don't know if I've ever been that angry. Maybe a couple of times I can remember being so angry at something that my voice began to shake and tremble. But he was so angry. And remember now, when he left X number of years ago, they were in a spiritual plateau. They were honoring God. And he comes back, and the high priest has emptied out one of the rooms and put Tobiah and his stuff in there. Insult to injury. Therefore I cast forth all the household stuff of Tobiah out of the chamber. He must have gotten some servants, and they went in there and got his desk and his table and his bureau and his kitchen supplies and his pantry and whatever else he had in there, because he set up housekeeping, and threw it out. Now, I doubt that he threw it into the temple court. That was still sacred territory. He probably marched it outside the walls and dumped it on the floor, on the ground. He's fortunate he didn't grab Tobiah by the hair and dump him out. Then I commanded, and they cleansed the chambers. There's a lesson here. As soon as we allow sin into our life, it messes everything up. It moves, it replaces some spiritual things. And I just don't want to go into it right now, but that's a good thought, some good thoughts right there. That isn't all. You'd think that'd be bad enough. But notice the temple worship is neglected. Verse 10, and I perceived that the portions of the Levites had not been given to them. Well, of course not. They'd emptied the chambers out where they kept all the supplies for the Levites. So the Levites are now forced to leave Jerusalem and go back to their cities and farm their farms in order to feed their families. They were supposed to be in the temple, serving God in the temple, and eating from the tithes of corn and wine and meat that the people brought. That was the plan. That was God's plan. For the Levites and the singers that did the work were fled everyone to his own field. Then contended I. There's that word. It's going to show up several times. The word contend means to strive physically or with words. You'll see that Nehemiah first contends with words, and before this thing is over, he's going to get real physical with some of these folks. Then contended I with the rulers and said, why is the house of God forsaken? Now, what happens in your life and mine when we allow sin to come in our lives like Tobiah, and that replaces the things of God, empties out the chambers, that replaces the things of God. You replace Bible reading with something else. You replace prayer time with something else. You replace witnessing with something else. And it has a ripple effect. So now they begin to neglect the house of God. That's interesting. The phrase house of God appears 90 times in the Bible. Of those 90 times, if I remember correctly, I counted them, all but about 3 references are to a visible place of assembly where God's people met. The tabernacle was not the first, but the tabernacle was called the house of God. Then the temple was referred to the house of God, which it is here. It's interesting, in the New Testament, you know what the local church is referred to? The house of God, the pillar and ground of the truth. When we refer to the church building where we worship as the house of God, that really has biblical warrant to it. Now, I know we don't have a New Testament temple, but God's people have always met somewhere. And very quickly they met in houses, buildings. So here's what happened. Here what happened. Secondly, not only is separation ignored, that's the first thing, I don't think I gave that to you. Separation is ignored, but secondly, the temple worship is neglected. Whenever you've got sin in your life and you start replacing with spiritual, with carnal things, before long you start missing church. I want to stop here because we'll go back here and finish something in a moment. Let's drop down to verse 15. It's still not over. Now we see that the Sabbath is desecrated. Now, what's significant about the Sabbath? To us, we might glide over this and say, well, that was just something back then. The Sabbath was a day of rest, but more than that, it was a sign between God and Israel that they were recognizing God's rule. In other words, they were saying God rules over every day, and we're going to give him one day of the week, the Sabbath. It's kind of like the tithe. We're saying that God owns everything, every material thing, but we're going to give him a tithe as a token of recognition that he owns it all. That's why we give the tithe. 10% belongs to him. In the New Testament age, I do not believe that the Sunday replaces the Sabbath. I don't want you to think I think that. I don't believe that. But I do think the New Testament refers, at least I think a couple occasions, to Sunday as the Lord's Day. I often use that term, this Lord's Day. I do believe that Sunday is the Lord's Day. I really do believe that. I believe the Bible teaches that. And we honor God on the Lord's day as if to say He owns it all. All 7 days are His, but this day is uniquely His. And so what they were doing, they were desecrating the Sabbath. And notice it says, verse 15, in those days saw I in Judah some trading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in the sheaves and lading asses, and also wine, grapes, and figs. They were doing their business, farming their farms, gathering their grapes, and all manner of burdens which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. Now there was not one thing wrong that they did there in verse 15 on the other days of the week. That had been fine. But this day was a day of rest. This day was a day of worship. This day was a day that they commemorated that God owned them. Notice what he says in verse 17. Then I contended, same word, with the nobles of Judah, and said, what evil thing is this that you do and profane the Sabbath day? You might want to jot down your margin Jeremiah 17, verse 22 and 23. In that passage, Jeremiah, this was several years before this, Jeremiah denounced Sabbath breaking as part of the reason God was going to judge Israel and send them into Babylonian captivity. So here it is, Sabbath breaking, desecrating the Sabbath is one of the things that brought them into Babylonian captivity for these 70 years. And now what are they doing? They're doing the same thing all over again. How many times has the Lord chastened you about something in your life? Through a sermon, through some incident. And you say, ouch, Lord, oh, I'm sorry, I won't do that. And you're being business and you're serious. And things move along, and then you wind up doing the same thing you did earlier. What evil is this that you do and profane the Sabbath day? Then notice how he dealt with it. Verse 19, came to pass that when the gates of Jerusalem began to be dark before the Sabbath. Now remember, sundown was when a new day begins. There's been some debate among the rabbis. Is it when the sun begins to go down? Is it when the darkness begins to come? Is it when the sun disappears? But evidently, he's saying as it began to get dark. So even before the Sabbath had officially begun on sundown, he shut the gates and charged that they should not be open till after the Sabbath. In other words, Saturday sundown. They could open up again. Till after the Sabbath. And some of my servants set I at the gates. He didn't trust these guys. So he sent some of his own servants to stand at the gates and forbid the Jews from coming back and forth. That there should be no burden be brought in on the Sabbath day. So the merchants, this is funny if it's not so serious. So the merchants and sellers of all kinds were of ware lodged without Jerusalem once or twice. So for a couple of weeks, these Gentiles who had been trading on the Sabbath, they thought, well, this won't last. Hadn't lasted for all these years. Nehemiah had been gone. We'll just wait it out. Won't last. Sounds like the devil. I'll just leave them alone a little while. It won't last. They don't mean business. Then I liked this. Then I testified against them. He went after these Gentiles and said to them, why lodge ye about the wall? If ye do so again, I will lay hands on you. I'm going to put you under arrest. I'm going to throw you in jail. Now, by the way, he had the authority to do this. I don't have the authority to go to somebody's home on the Lord's Day and arrest them and put them in jail. I've thought about it, but I haven't done it. Can't do it. He said, I'll do it. I'll arrest you. And then it says, from that time forth came they no more on the Sabbath. It says, okie dokie. They believed him. And then he prayed. I didn't mention in verse 14 the first prayer he prayed. Here, remember, Nehemiah would often pray and write down his prayers. In verse 14 he said, remember me, O my God. Now he says the same thing in verse 22. Remember me, O my God. So he's praying for God to bless his work. Then the home's violated. Now that's no shocker. When God's people began to violate their separation, they begin to play loose with sin, and they permit things into their lives they shouldn't have, like Tobiah. And it affects the worship of God, the public worship. It affects our tampering with those things that mark us as Christians, like Bible reading and prayer and soul winning and godliness. We begin to see well, it's no wonder then that the home is affected next. Look what they did. In those days also, saw I Jews that had married wives of Ashdod, now you know that name, of Ammon and of Moab. Now you remember when Israel was coming out of the wilderness after 40 years, they wanted to cross into Palestine in a southern direction. They wanted to come up from the south. But Moab and Ammon would not let them cross. And so God said, I want you to have nothing to do with Moab and Ammon. By the way, that's interesting how the grace of God brought Ruth. She was a Moabitess. And so Jesus is descended on the human side from this Moabitess woman. That's the grace of God, but that's another sermon. And notice this, and their children spake half in the speech of Ashdod, and could not speak in the Jews a language, but according to the language of each people. They had so intermingled over this period of time that the children born of these forbidden marriages were actually not speaking Hebrew. How many Christian homes have had moms and dads who have not taken care of their children, not watched after their children, and those kids grow up not speaking Christian? They don't walk with the Lord. That's not always that way. I do believe there are good and godly parents who've done the right things, but their children make bad decisions. I've pastored enough people like that. But I can also tell you about churches I've pastored where parents would go home, and on the way home they have roasted preacher. They'd criticize the preacher and the sermon, and they'd criticize the songs, and they'd criticize this and that and the other, and then they wonder why, when their kids get older, they don't want to go to church. Well, you've torn it down, you've cut it down. When you don't support the church, and you don't support the preacher, and you don't support the Sunday school teachers, and you don't support that, those kids hear that. And they're not stupid. They add 1 and 1, it equals 2. And that's the reason so many Christian fundamental Baptist homes, when the kids get older, they don't speak the language. And they move on. As I said, it doesn't always happen that way, but I believe it happens a lot. So what did he do? Now watch this. Verse 25. And I contended with them and cursed them. Now it doesn't mean he started using bad words and bad language and cussing them. No, I believe he preached on them the curses of the book of Deuteronomy. Remember Deuteronomy, Moses said, or God said to Moses, if you'll do this, I'll bless, bless, bless. But if you do this, I'll curse, curse, curse. And I believe that Nehemiah began to read those curses on these parents who'd allowed their kids to be messed up because of this wrong kind of marriages. Then he said, and smote certain of them. Now, if anything, this shows how seriously Nehemiah took the breach of the home. Boy, he raised his hand, and it says he plucked off their hair. Now, first time I read that, I thought it meant he snatched them bald. But I did some more research, and it probably means he grabbed a hold of their beards, which Jews thought as of a matter of pride, and jerked it out of their face. Now, the worst I do is preach a long sermon, so you ought to thank God. And made them swear by God. Now again, this is a different dispensation. He's under authority as the authority of the king. It's a different situation. But the point is, I mean, he would not tolerate this garbage anymore. And he said, notice what he said. This is interesting, verse 26. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin by these things? Didn't Solomon do the same things you guys are doing? Yet among many nations was there no king like him who was beloved of his God. In other words, he was a good guy. He loved the Lord, and he did for a good while. And the Bible says these strange women, meaning foreign women, corrupted his heart and ruined his home life. And that's where, remember, Solomon eventually lost his son Rehoboam. It says, nevertheless, even him did outlandish women cause to sin. Shall we then hearken unto you to do all this great evil? That sounds like what he said earlier in verse 17. What evil is this? He's repeating himself. And then verse 28, and this is the last one, leadership is compromised. Separation is ignored. Temple is neglected. The Sabbath is desecrated. Marriage or the home is violated, and now leadership is compromised. And one of the sons of Joiada, and not Joiada, one of his sons, the son of Eliashib. So here's Eliashib, his son Joiada, and one of his sons, or a grandson of Eliashib. Now, this grandson would have been in line perhaps to the high priesthood. He certainly was a priest. It says he was son-in-law to Sanballat. Eliashib probably married one of his daughters off to Tobiah. So Jehoiada, his son, saw no problem with marrying one of his sons off to Sanballat's daughter. You know, folks, we do not live on an island. Everything you do influences somebody else. And notice at the end of verse 28, what he did to this son of Joiada, I chased him from me. I don't know what that means. I don't know if it means it took a whip and went after him. I don't know if it means he picked up a pole and went after him, but he chased him. Probably from the temple. And notice he switches in verse 29, remember them. Oh my God. He said in verse 14, remember me. He said in verse 22, remember me. Now he says, Lord, don't forget them. Because they have defiled the priesthood. That's why I'm saying Joiada's son was a priest. So not only was he violating God's plan of intermarriage, but he was violating as a priest. Of all people, a priest. And he closes out, remember me, oh my God, for good. Now here's what I want to say, just to give you a few thoughts and I'm done. We'll go home. Go back to verse 13. He's dealing with this temple problem. And he said, I made treasurers over the treasuries. So Eliashib is out of the picture. He probably fired him. Got a new high priest, I'm guessing. Shelemiah, the priest, he might have been the replacement. And Zadok the scribe, and of the Levites, Pedaiah, and next to him was Hanan, the son of Zachar, the son of Mattaniah. You might remember Mattaniah was one of those men whose name showed twice in chapter 2 as one of the work crew leaders. Notice this, for they were counted faithful. Now here's what I want to say before I'm gone. In this mess that he was in, this was the second mess, but in all this mess that he was in, what he looked for were faithful men. I've said it before in the last couple of months. Our church has and is going through some really deep, deep waters. And I'm sure every one of you have thought what your pastors thought, are we going to survive? Are we going to survive? The answer is, if we will be faithful. You know, in your Christian life, all of you can probably remember times when you really went through some deep water. Maybe it was a physical health problem. Maybe it was a financial crisis. Maybe it was a home crisis, someone in your home or someone in your family. And you prayed and prayed, and you thought God was dead. No answer. Quiet. You knew better, of course. You had a Bible. But you were astounded at the quietness of God. But if you'll remember, as you stayed faithful, God brought you out on the other side, and you were better for it. We're in our valley. With the pandemic, I think that brought a lot of it on. And began to lose people that just didn't feel comfortable to come. And I'm not fussing at those. I'm glad they're on Zoom. And we lost some other way through death. And we're struggling. But I was thinking a moment ago what the Bible says in Galatians 6, be not weary in well-doing. Is it good to come to church, sing the songs of our faith, and read the Bible and preach? Yeah, it's good. Be not weary in well-doing. For ye, what's the next word? Shall, that's future, reap. Does it stop there or does it go on? If you faint not. Nehemiah said, I need some faithful men. This guy, Eliashib, is a fool. And he's rebelled. And he's not worthy to be high priest. You'll see later on, his sons, or his grandson isn't either. I'll give these 4 guys, I'll give them opportunity, I'll give them responsibilities. And the reason I'll do that is because they're faithful. Now, faithful doesn't mean necessarily always, a routine like coming to church Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday. He's faithful. That's part of faithfulness. But really, faithfulness in the Bible means more of trustworthy and reliable. There are some people in this church and all the churches I've pastored. If I gave them a job to do, I could walk away from it. Not worry about it. They were going to do it. My secretary was like that. She's now my mother, my stepmother. But Mrs. Hester, Freda Hester, was my secretary. She not only did letters and things like that secretaries do, but I gave her responsibilities. I would often have banquets. I had a lot of banquets. I'd call her in and say, Freda. I didn't call her Freda. I always called her Mrs. Hester. Miss Hester, here's the banquet. Here's the date. Here's the theme. Here's what I want to accomplish. Take care of it. I never had to worry about a thing. She organized the servers. She organized the food. She organized the banquet. She organized everything. All I did was show up. She was like that in a lot of things. I'd give her jobs to do. There are other people I've done that over the years. People I've given jobs to and responsibilities to or volunteered for things. Never had to even ask about it. Why? They're faithful, reliable, dependable. Bible Baptist Church will not be built on the basis of morning glories. You know, that kind of flower that shows well in the daytime, but by nighttime it's over with. Bible Baptist Church will not be built through this crisis that we're in by morning glory Christians. It'll be built by Christians who will say, "Nah, I'm not having a good time right now. This isn't fun. And the room is awful empty. But I'm going to be faithful. I'm going to be consistent. I'm going to be reliable. And whatever job God's given me, I'm going to do it until Jesus takes me." You know what? Folks, just remember that. God's put you here for such a time as this. The Lord says it's easy to start that church. That's easy to start it. It's easy. People begin to come, and boy, man, that was easy. But I think what I'll do is I'll put them through the ringer. I'll take 2 of my sweet choice servants and I'll bring them home to me. I'm going to bring them home one of these days anyway, so I'll bring them home. I'll see how they'll behave. I'll let some of the congregation come by Zoom. I'll see how they behave. On Zoom or in person. I'll see how they'll behave. And I cry out to the Lord, Lord, let us grow. Please let us grow. See, I'm thinking numbers. God said, I'm letting you grow, but not like you think. And I believe with all my heart, folks, if we will be faithful, we'll come out of this on the other side. You say, what would we look like? I have no idea. But if we'll walk with the Lord, once we get on the other side and look back, we'll say, that was worth it. God's doing something for us. Nehemiah built this great, great project. And toward the last chapter, you have what appears to be several massive failures. But how does he close out? What's the end of the book? Remember me, O my God, for good. In Jesus' name, amen. That's how he ended. A prayer. Let's us do that. Let's be faithful. Even when it doesn't seem like God is rewarding that faithfulness. Even when it doesn't seem like things are getting better. Let's just be faithful. I want to be, by the grace of God, a faithful pastor. I want to preach to you, whether there's 13 of you here or 213 of you here. I want to be faithful. And I'm doing my best to do my part. I really am. I don't cut corners because it's a small crowd. I don't do that. You probably wish I'd cut a few corners, but I'm not going to. But let's be faithful. I'm going to try my best to be faithful. Do my best. When I stand before you, I'm going to have something from the Lord, something from the Word that'll help you. Let's pray one for another and be faithful. God reward us if we faint not. So don't listen to the devilish whispers. Don't listen to the whispers of the flesh. Just be faithful, steady. Doing whatsoever is with thy hand findeth to do, do it with all thy might. And we get on the other side of this valley, and we will. All valleys eventually end. We'll be able to say, we went through this together. There may be a bond between us that exists much deeper than anything we've experienced before. Well, amen.